The World Junior Hockey Championship begins on Boxing Day. Canada, actually, for the one time in the tournament, playing the early matchup. And it's not World Juniors time on Winnipeg Sports Talk without catching up with our guy, Scott Wheeler from The Athletic, to tee up the tournament. Scott, how are you?
Off to Sweden on Christmas Day, so I'm looking forward to getting over there and diving into coverage.
Always an exciting time for the young players as well as people on the draft beat like yourself. We'll get to Team Canada in a minute. Obviously, Winnipeg Jet fans have been very interested as to the status of Rutger McGroarty for Team USA. And some great news recently. Not only will Rutger play in the tournament, but he will be wearing the C. Tell us a little bit of what we've learned about McGroarty's injury and his role on what should be a very good U.S. team.
Yeah, my understanding is that the impact on his fall was actually sort of to his chest. It was more of a rib lung situation. I believe he broke one of his ribs and punctured his lung, and that was the injury, if you will. Sounds to me like this is not the likely outcome. This is not what anybody was kind of expecting. His timetable, based off the initial conversations I had with people in his camp and people at Michigan, it sounded like his timetable was sort of more the middle of January. So this is, we're looking at least 3, maybe 4 weeks early in terms of getting back. But he's been a leader for this group. The captaincy was the least surprising piece of the puzzle for me. I think if he was healthy, that was to be expected. He was the captain of their U18 team back when this age group was at the national program. He's a returnee. If anybody's ever sort of watched an interview of Rutger or spoken to him, you learn pretty quick that he's a very charismatic kid, extremely well-spoken, tons of life and energy. So big fan of the kid. I've always loved and sort of enjoyed my chats with him, and he's the perfect captain for this team, and it sounds like he's going to be good to go, hopefully, come Boxing Day, which is a big boost for them as well, because he's a top 6 left winger. On top of wearing the C, he's an important piece of this team.
You know, Scott, you mentioned, your chats with him. We've had him on a couple times on the program, and he has such an incredible passion and energy. I would say, you said it's the least surprising thing that he's the captain. If there was a player that was going to come back ahead of schedule to be in an event like this to represent their country, I would have put Rutger at the top of that list, because you kind of had that feeling that regardless of what happened to him, it was going to take heaven and earth to keep him off that ice for this tournament. And lo and behold, there he is wearing the C.
Yeah, and they were disappointed with their outcome last year too, right? Like, bronze isn't what the U.S. at this stage in where the program's at and how strong they've become developing young players. Bronze isn't the end game for them. I'm sure they were happy at the end of the bronze medal game a year ago, but immediately it was reset to, okay, next year we're going to have a lot of returnees. We had a young team a year ago, and Rutger was always going to be a big factor in that. So credit to him for working his way back and getting ready. It sounded like I was at Canada's camp here in Oakville, but I wasn't in Plymouth for USA's camp. But my colleagues, Corey Pronman and Max Bultman, were both there, and it sounds like he looked really good in that camp. He was wearing a non-contact jersey still at that point, but it sounded to me like he was sort of trending in the right direction and sort of feeling good and looking good on the ice. So that's huge for them. And they might be the favorites. The Americans might be the gold medal favorites. In fact, they would be my pick if I had to pick, sort of gun to my head kind of thing. They'd be my pick in this year's tournament. They're extremely deep at forward, really 4 lines that are stronger than any other 4-line sort of team in this year's tournament. 3 excellent returnees on defense, and then arguably the 2 best goalies in the tournament as well. So they've got it all. They're a little bit thinner on defense than I think they'd like to be. Their third pairing is maybe the one area of this roster that I think they'd like to be a little stronger at. But other than that, this is as good an American team as we've seen in some time, and Rutger's a sort of going to be a leading focal point of that.
Well, just staying on USA before we move forward. Obviously, Rutger, a returnee, and will be wearing the C. But I go down their forward lines, and these are the guys we were all talking about last year in Nashville, getting their names called in the first round of the NHL draft. A lot of players that popped up in round 1 last year will be wearing the Stars and Stripes.
Yeah, I mean they've got the returning best line in the history of the program, at least from a production standpoint. No line in the history of the program that's including what Jack Hughes and Cole Caulfield did, right? It's including what Austin Matthews and Kachuk did. This was a special line, and they're all likely going to play together at 5-on-5 again. And that's obviously Will Smith, who was a top 5 pick in last year's draft to San Jose. Gabe Perreault, who was a first rounder to the Rangers, and Ryan Leonard, who was a first rounder of the Washington Capitals. So that's already one trio that has dominated this age group, and not just dominated it, but like 2-3 points per game each in international events for all three of those kids. Kind of the perfectly made line, two natural playmakers and finishers and creators, alongside Ryan Leonard, who really gets after it, a worker, a physical type. And that's not even their best line. Their best line is probably going to be the trio of Cutter Gauthier, who's played at a men's world championships. Cutter actually scored 7 goals for Team USA in 10 games at men's worlds last year and was one of the best forwards on that senior men's national team at men's worlds. Lane Hutson also played at men's worlds last year on the back end for Team USA. So this level is almost below guys like Lane Hutson and Cutter Gauthier. I could see Lane Hutson breaking the tournament D points record, which is 14 points in 7 games, or at least chasing it. The Americans have a bit of a softer group than Canada does. Canada and Sweden are both in the same group. The Americans, their 2 best opponents are going to be the Slovaks and the Czechs. So there's an opportunity for them to really do some damage. That's without getting into Jimmy Snuggerud, one of the best players in college hockey. Gavin Brindley, one of the better players in college hockey, who's also a returnee for them up front. Frank Nazar, a first-round pick. Isaac Howard, another first-round pick. It's a loaded American team. And then I mentioned the goalies earlier, but Trey Augustine has been a stud for this team internationally for the 04s and 05s. He actually played up a year as a 16-year-old at U18 Worlds. So he's got 2 U18 Worlds plus last year's World Juniors under his belt as a goaltender. And then Jacob Fowler has actually been the even better goalie. A second-round pick of the Montreal Canadiens has been an even better goalie in college hockey this year for Boston College than Trey Augustine has been. So there's going to be a legitimate goalie battle there with 2 excellent netminders. So they've got everything they need to win gold. And I think they could put up, as we've seen in the last couple of years, it's a little bit more of a watered down tournament without the Russians. And this American team and the Canadians have really run up some scores. I think you're going to see that from the Americans through the round robin. And then once they get against Canada and Sweden, I think they're the odds on favorites.
Just staying with Jet prospects for a minute, the Jets will also have Elias Salomonsson playing in. And, for the host Swedes, I'm sure there's a lot of excitement for that team. Tell us about his season so far, what you've seen from him playing again with men over in the Swedish Elite League, and what will his role be, and how prominent do you think he'll be on the host team?
Yeah, Salomonsson's going to be a big part of this team. They've got the deepest blue line in the tournament for sure. They have 7 legitimately excellent defensemen at this level. They have 5 of those 7 are returnees, and the other 2 are Salomonsson and Matthias Havlid, who I was told last year would have both been on the team last year if not for injuries. So he sort of broke his ankle last year, and it derailed what was an excellent start to last season. He actually shocked Skellefteå and the coaching staff and management group there in the SHL last year. This is going back to last October, with how good he looked coming out of what was a disappointing draft year for him. The only reason he was available in the second round for the Jets was because of a disappointing draft year. He has been tremendous. He's looked like a first-round pick virtually ever since then. He's playing a big role. He's playing 17, 18 minutes a night for that team, which is, as a teenager in the SHL, which is arguably the second or third best pro league in the world right now, is a big deal. That Skellefteå team, the top prospect on that team is Axel Sandin Pellikka, the first rounder of the Detroit Red Wings. So he gets a little bit more of the shine and the attention in terms of just talk about the young players on that Skellefteå team. But Salomonsson's been right there with Sandin Pellikka this year. He's played a big role. He's played big minutes at times. He's more of a two-way guy than Sandin Pellikka. And I know I'm working on a story on Salomonsson that'll be out during the tournament. And in speaking with people in Skellefteå, they expect him to be one of the best defensemen in this tournament. He's an excellent skater, really gets up and down the ice. He's a big, strong kid, two-way type, but can really move pucks and skate. There's a lot to like about Salomonsson. I think he's going to be a good sort of number 4, number 5 defenseman in the NHL and give the Jets good value given where they selected him.
Scott Wheeler from The Athletic with us on Winnipeg Sports Talk, getting ready to drop the puck at the World Junior Hockey Championships on Boxing Day in Sweden. So let's get to the Canadians. Canada got a nice early Christmas present from the Boston Bruins, getting Matt Poitras loaned to the club. How does the red and white shape up, Scott?
Not as strong as they've been in recent years. Obviously, they're going for the three-peat. This would be their first three-peat since 2009. So this is something they care about it. I've asked them about it. The management group with Hockey Canada, they'll downplay it and say that it's sort of 1 year at a time. But making some history, I think, would be a big deal to them. They also, people forget, both of their sort of last two gold medals. They nearly lost to the Slovaks in overtime last year in Halifax. And the year before that, it took Mason McTavish pulling a puck off of the goal line for them to beat the Finns and win that gold. So they could have been 0 for 2 in golds coming into this. And now it's okay. The three-peat's within reach. And it's not a strong group as far as Hockey Canada goes. They are still a gold medal contender. They're still one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the tournament. They can still beat any of these teams on any given night. I'm confident in that. But it's a group that's thin on star power. When you start talking about depth, which is what this management group and coaching staff have started to talk about, certainly that's a calling card for Hockey Canada. They're deeper at forward and on defense than most teams in this tournament. But when you're talking about depth, it usually means that there's something lacking up front, and that's the way that this group feels. They're counting on Macklin Celebrini, a 17-year-old, to be excellent. That's very hard to do in this tournament. We lose sight of it because of the 20 points that Connor Bedard had last year, right? And Alexis Lafreniere won MVP at this tournament in his draft year, but those are more uncommon than not. Alexis Lafreniere was also almost a full year older than Macklin Celebrini. Macklin Celebrini's a summer birthday. But they need him. They need him to be star power. They need him to be their best forward or second best forward if they're going to win a gold medal. There's a lot riding on him. There's a lot riding on 3 players on the back end. I expect that when push comes to shove, this isn't actually a super deep group on the back end, but they do have 3 players at the top in Denton Mateychuk, Tristan Luneau, and Maverick Lamoureux, who are top players at this level. And I think all 3 could play 25 plus minutes a night, with a couple, probably Tristan Luneau, pushing 30 in this tournament when it matters most. So they're going to need those guys. They're going to need Matt Savoy, who obviously West Coast hockey fans and Winnipeg fans are familiar with from his time with the Winnipeg Ice. They're going to need Matt Savoy to be a top player in this tournament. They're going to need Jordan Dumais, the Columbus Blue Jackets second rounder, who's been lighting it up for the last 2 seasons. Well, really the last 3 seasons, but especially the last 2 seasons in the QMJHL, putting up numbers that we haven't seen since Sidney Crosby was in the league, kind of thing. So they're counting on a few players to be stars, and if those guys can't be that for them at the same level that Cutter Gauthier is going to be for the Americans, and Will Smith is going to be for the Americans, and Lane Hudson is going to be for the Americans, and Seamus Casey is going to be for the Americans. If they can't match that level, they might be in tough. They might be more of a silver or a bronze medal team in this year's event. But if they get the best out of guys like Celebrini and Savoy and those 3 on the back end, they'll have a chance to play with anybody.
Scott, speaking of the back end, you mentioned Denton Mateychuk. He, of course, is from Dominion City here in Manitoba. You mentioned what a big role he's going to be, and I imagine he's likely going to be the QB on the power play as well, getting significant responsibility when Canada has the man advantage.
Yeah, for sure. Denton's the real deal. I think there's a chance he's the captain of this team as well. I expect that announcement in the next 48 hours here. I think there's a real chance he's a captain. If not, I would expect him to wear a letter. They like him a lot. They like it. Obviously, the offense is the offense. That's his bread and butter. He's riding a season-long point streak in the WHL at the moment. There hasn't been a single game he's played in the WHL that he hasn't registered a point in this season. He had 2 goals yesterday in their first pre-tournament game against a U25 team from Denmark. He's going to be a huge part of this team. Power play, obviously, but I think they think, despite the fact that he's only 5'11" and he's sort of on the smaller side, I think they think he can be a big time defender at this level as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing this, what he can do in this tournament. There's been so much attention placed on that young group that the Blue Jackets have, whether it's Adam Fantilli, David Jiricek, you go down the list, Cole Sillinger, Kent Johnson. But I think Denton's got an opportunity to be a real big part of the future of the Columbus Blue Jackets, as does Jordan Dumais. And those guys this Team Canada is going to go as far as those two Blue Jackets prospects might take them in this tournament. So they're going to need him to be putting up points. They're going to need him to play big minutes defensively. And he's going to have to sort of do it all for this team on the back end.
Scott, what about the goaltending situation for Canada, and how big of a surprise was it the Jet draft pick Dom Divincentiis didn't crack the roster?
I think if you'd asked me that question in the summer, coming off the season that he'd had in North Bay, OHL goaltender of the year, all of that, I would have told you that he was probably a front runner, if not to be the number one, then certainly to be sort of in the tandem, no less than a number three, that's for sure. So that speaks to the struggles that he's had this year. He hasn't been good this year. He wasn't good in camp. I think they decided going into camp that this wasn't a year where they had Dylan Garand or Devin Levi or Joel Hofer. For all the talk of what Canada has, the question marks around Canadian goaltending development and the pipeline for goalies in this country, Canada has actually got excellent performances in recent years from their goaltenders. Hofer, Levi were both tremendous. Dylan Garand was very good. Last year, Thomas Milic didn't start the tournament as a starter, but emerged and was tremendous for Canada and made a game-saving save in overtime in the quarterfinals against Slovakia. They could have ended their tournament and had a much different history in terms of talking about last year's team and Bedard and the gold medal and all of that. So they entered this camp thinking, okay, we've got four guys. We're going to invite them all. And whoever plays better in the two games against the U Sports and the red and white scrimmage are going to be our guys. And the fact of the matter is that he struggled. He struggled in practice. He looked leaky in practice. There were a couple of times where the coaches were warming him up and he was letting shots from the coaching staff leak through him. And a couple of times where I turned to colleagues and said, Dom just doesn't look up to this. So I'm sure disappointing for him because he is a legit prospect. He was very good last year. He's a 19-year-old, so this was his last kick of the can, but just sort of didn't win the job, and they left it open this year. It wasn't going to be about pedigree. It was going to be about riding the hot hand, and he just wasn't the hot hand for this year.
Scott will be focusing in on the Jet prospects and Team Canada, but for draftniks, they always like to pay attention to young men that are going to hear their names called in the first round. You mentioned Macklin Celebrini. He could go number one overall. Just quickly, any other key draft eligible players in this tournament that fans should make a point of keeping their eye on?
Yeah, a couple of them. The big one after Celebrini is probably Konsta Helenius with the Finns. They're in Canada's group. Canada plays the Finns on Boxing Day, so you'll get introduced to him early in the tournament if you tune in. Helenius is a top 5 to 10 pick in this upcoming draft, and this is a very weak Finnish team relative to recent years. They didn't get Joakim Kemmel back from the Nashville Predators. They are dealing with 2 injuries to Aaron Kiviharju, who would have been another top prospect playing for them for the 2024 draft, and Jesse Nurmi, an Islanders prospect. They've got Calgary Flames prospect Topi Rani, who would have been a returnee but is under investigation for rape back home in Finland and is not participating with the team. So this is a group that, as is, for the Finns, was already thin. And then you subtract 4 or 5 guys who would have been a part of it, and suddenly it's really thin. And as a result, Helenius and Emil Hemming, the other top prospect for 2024 with this Finnish group, both of them could play leading roles. There's a chance that Konsta Helenius is a top 6 center for the Finns, maybe even their first line center. He's certainly going to be on their first power play. He's been excellent at the pro level in Finland this year for an 18-year-old, having a tremendous season, a better season than we saw Jesperi Kotkaniemi, who went 3rd overall, for example, have. A better season than Juraj Slavkovsky, who went 1st overall, had. So that piece of it is exciting. He's smaller for a centerman, but a legit sort of 5'10", 5'11" skill guy. And then the other one, if I mentioned David Jiricek, the Columbus Blue Jackets 5th overall pick a moment ago. His younger brother, Adam, is a top 15, top 20 pick. There are some scouts who believe he's a top 10 guy. I'm not quite there. But Adam Jiricek, who's coming off of an injury of his own, similar to McGroarty, was injured about a month ago and is now back and fully healthy. Adam's going to be a staple on the back end for this Czech team this year. So those are probably the 3 guys other than Celebrini that I would immediately sort of draw your attention to. If there was one more, I'd add Zeev Boyum, who's going to potentially be I talked about the big three on the blue line for the Americans, but he could be their fourth guy in that top four there. If not, going to be a huge part of their third pairing and likely run the second power play unit behind Lane Hudson for that team. Zeev has had a borderline historic season in college hockey. He's one of the leading scorers in college hockey as a defenseman for Denver. He's playing sort of first pairing minutes as a true freshman at Denver under David Carl, who is the head coach at Denver and also the head coach of this American team at the World Juniors. So he's a legitimate prospect. His older brother Shai is a prospect of sort of was a second round pick of the Detroit Red Wings, but Zeev is a full cut above that, sort of doing things like Adam Fox and Cale Makar and Quinn Hughes type of numbers. Maybe not that level of a prospect in terms of a true sort of future star, but I think the expectation is that Zeeb's going to be a good offensive defenseman in the NHL, and people are really going to get introduced to him on that American team.
Yeah, it's pretty good company to be mentioned in with those names. Scott Wheeler is with us. Scott, I know you got to run, get out to Sweden. Thanks so much for doing this, and fill people in on what you and the athletic team will have cooking from Sweden throughout the tourney.
Yeah, I've got stories prepped on 9 or 10 guys that I want to dive in on, guys I haven't told sort of deep features on before that I think have interesting stories. As I mentioned off the top, for Jets fans, one of those is Salomonsson, so you can expect to feature on Salomonsson at some point while I'm over there. And then just the typical notebook and coverage. And then after the tournament, I'll jump right into my annual prospect pool rankings, which is kind of my biggest project of the year. So I'll be doing prospect rankings for all 32 teams at the Athletic in January, and the Jets will obviously sort of feature amongst that. And they've got a pretty good thing going with McGroarty and Lucius, and Brad Lambert's had a bounce back season at the pro level this year, and they've got some good young talent coming there, and obviously Salomonsson's a part of that as well. So looking forward to, once the tournament wraps, to breaking down all of the Jets prospects.
Well, listen, have a great tourney, a very happy New Year, and Merry Christmas with the fam before you head out, and we'll be calling you to get back and talk some Jet prospects coming up in 2024. Thanks for doing this, Scott.
Thanks, pal.